Time in the campaign. Game time is of utmost importance. Failure to keep careful track of time expenditure by player characters will result in many anomalies in the game. The stricture of time is what makes recovery of hit points meaningful. Likewise, the time spent adventuring in wilderness areas removes concerned characters from their bases of operation, be they rented chambers or battlemented strongholds. Certainly the most important time stricture pertains to the manufacture of magic items, for during the period of such activity no adventuring can be done. Time is also considered in gaining levels and learning new languages and more. All of these demands upon game time force choices upon player characters, and, likewise, number their days of game life. One of the things stressed in the original game of D&D was the importance of recording game time with respect to each and every player character in a campaign. In AD&D, it is emphasized even more. You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept.
And that is page 37 of the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, written by Gary Gygax. I am historian, podcaster, gadfly, father, man about town, Ben Riggs, and with me as always is the dark, the mysterious, the brooding, the reincarnation of Brandon Lee that is Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good morning, everybody.
And before anything else, we want to mention the Patreon. For a mere $3 a month, you get access to our Discord and have the delight and satisfaction of knowing that you are supporting the podcast, which does cost money. Just yesterday, I discovered that it costs $20 now to get our podcast on Apple Podcast. $20 that I immediately coughed up, but still, your money will help keep this show going. And I've been thinking about this. This might be an edit here, but conceptually, I'm kind of thinking that we should try and do everything we can to make the $3 level so amazing that everyone has to get it, instead of spending a lot of time thinking about what to do for higher levels. I'm kind of like, try and get every single Plot Points listener on board. Like, if we could get everyone we already have on board with the Patreon, it's already like $1,000 a month. So just a thought, put that in your hopper, see what you think about it.
I think we need whales too, Ben. I think all we need is one. I think I'd go the opposite idea. I think we only need one patron. I think we should go for the actual medieval system, and we need to find some lord or liege that owns a large section of land and will give us, $10,000 every month, and then we don't have to worry about these small little fish wandering around listening to a thing. I'm kidding. Small fish are fantastic. I'm small. Yeah.
That was really funny. We're keeping this. Well done. All right.
Yeah.
So anything you want to say about anything, Scott Bruner?
No. I'm excited to talk a little bit about time and campaign. Should we talk about time and campaign?
You can talk about time and campaign, or else I was going to drop one very brief thing.
Please, drop away.
According to ICV2, the hobby gaming field grew by about 1% last year, less than the size of the increase of inflation. They reported D&D sales being down about 30%. Depending on where you looked, either role-playing games were slightly up or down. I'm still a little confuzzled on that one. But this is a safe space. This is a core audience. I will briefly say it was frustrating seeing some people who were calling me a moron 2 months ago now saying, well, of course this is happening. But that's all I'm going to say about that right now. Because again, it's a sad thing that, like, again, that the golden age of RPG thing, having the entire internet shout at me for a month was so frustrating and psychologically difficult that I am now in the disgusting situation of things are going badly, and yet I feel kind of good about it because it proves me somewhat briefly for this one shining moment a little bit right. Again, my prediction was like looking out 10 or 15 years. So you can't say what like 1 year's sales really proves anything. But again, this is actually bad news, but I psychologically am like, woof, I guess I wasn't so far out ahead of the field there anyway. So now I'm rambling though.
Yeah, Scott, I think that the problem with any prognostication is that, you're a historian. My mom was a historian. She taught at college as well. And I think the problem with any prognostication coming from any type of historical perspective is that there's just never, history is historianship is always the concept of like trying to, take individual observations to build kind of a narrative. And when you, of course, when you're in the midst of that narrative, it's difficult to say exactly what's going to happen. We've talked about, of course, the concept of the golden age of TRPGs, and again, that comes down to, what kind of how do we define necessarily what success in the TRPG field is? Because now that it is so big, are we going to define it as success by how many people are playing, how many people are buying books from Wizards of the Coast, or are we going to define it by how many people are creating their new games? Depending on what metric we choose, it's kind of a difficult thing to say. And also, there's so many different events at play. I think the fact that the pandemic is slow, it's funny how quickly we're forgetting the pandemic.
Yeah.
And putting it in our rear view mirror. But I mean,
Almost like it was a terrible thing that none of us want to think about or talk about anymore.
and here's a question for you, Ben. During the pandemic, how many articles did you get sent from relatives in your family that were like cut out from the New York Times or whatever local newspaper, and it was about people are playing Dungeons and Dragons at your local, like, remember that game from the 70s? Well, it's back. That's how people that write newspapers talk.
My family all knew I was kind of into it, so and also I think that more people play in Wisconsin than most places, so I think I got less than a lot of other people.
I got one like every week. I mean, I have a lot of friends who don't play D&D, but they would cut these articles out, or they would, they send them to me in the internet being like, "Hey, your little field is like getting big again."
I enjoy that
that's
voice,
how my
by
friends
the way.
talk too.
I love it. I love it. Stick with that voice, man.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna be straight. We're not gonna have any idea about what's happening because we're in the midst of it right now until we're a little ways out. But certainly, and we can talk about how, I mean, the field is quickly changing, and it's so, I don't know if there is another field of media that is necessarily so dynamic, which is interesting. So we just celebrated the 50th year of Dungeons and Dragons, and I still think tabletop role playing games are in some ways reconfiguring their place in our cultural landscape, right? Because they existed, but then they kind of fell out of favor. Well, and then everybody found video games, and now everybody that found video games now has completely been interpolated into the lexicon systems and mechanics of tabletop role-playing games. And we had a pandemic, and they're like, okay, well, what can we do? And like, well, we already know what these things mean, so it wasn't that hard for people to pick up 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons or whatever game that their friends were playing, and suddenly find themselves completely obsessed with this media that has been around for a while, but hasn't really gotten the cultural cachet or the cultural popularity. I mean, it's always had the cultural cachet, but for whatever reason, now it's so popular for folks to play, and it's so outside the subgenres that it was. And my kid's chess coach plays now. Like every time I turn around, and it's we've had this conversation before, but it's strange now to have conversations with Dungeons and Dragons that don't start with well, I do this one thing, but I hesitate to share it with
we don't
you.
have to talk about the
Right?
shame.
Yeah. Well, the fact that we played it with, all the school teachers that we currently played it with, who are obviously significantly younger than us. And again, never was there a moment where they were like, yeah. I mean, it's in, people put it in their work bios now.
Yeah. I mean, I like a thing I've talked about a lot on here that I will continue to talk about is I'll never forget the day I walked into the teacher's lounge and there were a bunch of people talking about D&D, and they were all women under 30. And I'm like, whoa, something has changed.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because you instantly gave me deja vu to when I came to University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and that was 8 years ago when I first came here, and I will never forget there was a get together for all of the new TAs at a local drinking hole. And I will never forget saying, every time you had to explain what I studied, it was always like, I've got to come up with an elevator pitch for this. I've got to explain what TRPGs are. Maybe Wisconsin has a higher, thanks to the weather, has a higher percentage of people that are playing tabletop role-playing games. We were coming from San Diego, where there are sometimes things to do outside. But I will never forget that first explaining what I was doing. They were like, oh yeah, we've got like 5 or 6 groups going on with all the grad students. And none of them studied it, but it had become really popular. And this is pre-pandemic.
I played D&D twice in the past 10 days. I played once and I ran once.
Mm-hmm.
Both were like old school Beck Me style.
Sure.
The one I ran, I got about 30 minutes notice that my One Ring campaign wasn't going to run that night, because if 2 people drop, I'm like, I'm not doing One Ring, and 2 people dropped. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to run old school essentials. I paid $5 for 21st level characters. I think I paid $1.50 for a one-page dungeon by Questing Beast. I think it was the Alchemist's Repose. Um, I read the one-page dungeon in about 10 minutes while taking notes. And then I went and ran game, and I'm going to say it took 2.5 hours to run through that one-page dungeon.
Mhm.
We always have a hard start at 7 and a hard out at 9:30 on Monday nights, and it was delightful. Like
Yeah.
it was a marvelous 2.5 hours, uh, and the the ease of running D&D, maybe even especially that D&D, really struck me. It's that version of D&D, the one where you're dungeon crawling, and you're only responsible really for the environment. It's just so easy to pick up and run, and it really democratizes the delight of creation. Um, in the same way that karaoke democratizes the delight of singing and says, "Hey, everybody can sing." D&D set and TTRPGs say you too can create a story. And it again, I like there's games I love more. I love Legend of the Five Rings. Much harder than D&D. I love that One Ring campaign I'm running. Again, it's much harder than D&D.
Yeah.
Uh, so the ease of it and the delight of it, and it really underlined D&D's utility as a gateway to the TTRPG hobby to me. But go ahead, Scott. And
Well,
then
we could. This might be able to bring us back to the Gary Gygax a little bit, but it's interesting to me because we had Gary Con last week, and thank you to all of the listeners that came to our live podcast. And I ran Winter's Daughter from 6 p.m. until midnight, and I was a little nervous around doing that, just because that's a long little haul, and I had been up since 5 a.m. Like, how am I going to get through to midnight? And I don't know if my players would agree. I mean, it seems like they had a fantastic time, but I don't want to speak for them. But I will say that was my favorite game I've ever run in a con. It was old school essentials, and I was running necrotic gnomes, and again, not sponsored yet by Necrotic Gnome, but we're open to offers. But anyway, Winter's Daughter is fantastic. If you want any adventure to splash into, I just love Winter's Daughter. It's probably only 30% combat, 70% kind of social / exploration of a dungeon. Same things you're kind of talking about. I mean, there's a reason, and I think we've talked about on the podcast before, why dungeons work so well, because it so wonderfully bounds what you have to necessarily create, and you can focus more, as you just kind of said, more on mood and theme, and less necessarily on what's going on in 800 other places of the dungeon, right? Or the outdoor wilderness. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but I'm saying, like, if you're trying to do something quick and accessible, dungeons is just always the way to go. But where was I going with that? Oh, I was thinking the classic Gary Gygax quotation, which is the one secret we don't want to let the game master know is they don't even need the rules, right? And I know we recently had a game session with a designer, 5th edition, and one of the themes that kept coming up in that conversation was, the term was like how the vibes are working at a table. And I also had this conversation last night in my Curse of Strahd game around, like, how much like, literally the people at the table and the world that you're creating and exactly what they want is so much of a rhetorical, like, Dungeons and Dragons is such a rhetorical game. You have to think about your audience. You have to think about how you're crafting the mood, theme, and the actual gameplay mechanics to the people that are sitting around that table if you want to have the experience that you're going to have. It is a rhetorical move. It's one that's obviously completely discursive. It's not a rhetorical art, coming one way from the DM. The DM has to read the players. They have to be both intuitive and somewhat mechanically minded to fit the mechanics of the system. But in the end, how much do the rules actually matter? Now, I don't want to stay on the sandbox too long, but what I think is really interesting, and this is how we can bring it back to this time section, is how early D&D texts don't we're so worried about, if we want to keep on the ethos, keep on the rhetorical angle, we're so worried about the ethos. We're so worried about making you believe in the game, because we're so worried about making what Gary has said apocryphally, well, not apocryphally, but had said outside of a book, which is you don't need game rules, to demonstrate that you do need game rules, because that's how, the Blooms and Gygax were going to feed their families. The the as I feel as we get deeper into an age where we're worried about what artificial intelligence can and cannot do. It's so fascinating. The tabletop role-playing games and their play are reminding us what AI and what digital systems can't do yet, I suppose, because of that, of what was termed in that game that you and I played as vibes. And as an academic, vibes is like, what does that mean? It's so specious. And yet we all kind of exactly know what it means, right? It's the feeling at the game table. It's the things that we can't quantify or topologize. It's the way that people get around a table and are feeling about what's going on. It's whether everyone is having enjoyment. It's the consensually collaborated experience that we're all having. And with that, I'll move aside. But how I guess the question is, Ben, maybe if you would answer this, how necessary are rules?
Sadly, this is something I've thought about a lot. Because again, there's a general. There was a long time where I think me and my friends were essentially anti-death in role-playing games.
No. Oh
Stops.
no.
I know it stops the. We're like it stops the story. It it really irritates the player. Like, and we were kind of anti-death, is the way I would have put it. And now that we're a bit older, I think we are getting more and more pro-death. Like in the Alchemist's Repose that I ran, it ended with a mechanical alchemist vomiting acid on a character who then melted like Toad at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, "Oh, that's awesome!" Everybody had 4 hit points. How far are we going to make it with our 4 hit points? And that was the answer. He failed his save against breath weapon and melted. Um, and like when we were against character death, I was like, what is the point of these dice in the rules? Like, what are we doing here if you can't die? What is the point? Um, and I honestly think that the rules and the dice are there to provide a suspension of disbelief. You need to have a suspension of disbelief for any creative work to get off the ground, and the dice and the rules are the things that separate it from playground make believe, where you argue about who shot who with a 6-shooter or whatever. And that's all there is. It's some idea that, like, much like the pagans would roll dice to discover the will of Zeus or Odin or whatever, we're doing the same thing. It's as though chance itself were the rule of the universe. By bringing dice into the game, we're somehow letting the universe decide, and the rules are simply the interpretation that we apply to the will of the universe. But now you
Well, it's the rules to me are a contract, right? They're an entity that exists in the real world outside kind of the imaginary realms that we're all kind of dwelling within. We're saying, okay, we're go with these contracts. But I think in the same, it's like if you think about the concept of, like, back in the day, contracts didn't necessarily have to be written or notarized. They could be, just a handshake was more than enough, right? And I think that's, that becomes the question. And now I'm thinking we have a listener who's a lawyer. A lot of these things are like, bring them on and to think about, like, what is the necessity of having, a contract? Why is it that people have to have things that exist in the real world before they can actually make, an agreement or a pact and stick by it? But it's interesting to me, again, coming back to the D&D, the D&D book, which is this concept that early editions of D&D were very much based on the concept that the contract was king, that it in many ways was more important than the consensual collaboration, that because I think the players, because they were coming to this medium new, weren't necessarily completely on board yet. They needed something they needed to know that there was a Gary Gygax out there that had done all the work to making real worlds, and that these types of texts were everything that you would need. These texts had I'm saying this on Easter, they had a divinity to them that we didn't possess. And certainly the folks writing these books wanted you to believe that, because again, they had to feed their families. I wanted to quickly go back and we can read time, but I'm flipping right now through Shadow Dark by Kelsey Tian, and I can't find the passage which in. And then for those of you, again, we are not yet sponsored by Shadow Dark, but open to that. And this is right now one of the most kind of popular current old school OSR systems. And if you haven't played Shadow Dark, I can't recommend it enough. It's so much fun to play. But and I'm going nuts here because I'm flipping through this because there's a section where Kelsey Deanne writes. Here it is. I found it. It's on Not the Enemy, which I love. It's a section about DMing, and she's talking about you're not the player's enemy. You're portraying the world as it is, which is very much how I run my games. Very much the concept of verisimilitude. Roll your dice out in the open and let the players create their own trouble. But when you were talking about character death, and I've never wavered from. To me, death is a fascinating mechanic in the game, and it builds tension and it creates. It's interesting because you're like, death ends the story. There's no like, tell that to George R.R. Martin,
I mean, in some ways, that's the problem, though, with George R.R.
Right.
Martin.
Maybe that's not the best example.
That is a fascinating example, but continue.
Well, it's funny because it's the one thing I don't like about Lord of the Rings, a spoiler, is that nobody dies in that book. There's no tension in the Lord of the Rings books. Like I've always found it amazing, especially like Two Towers, like they kind of defeat Saruman, and then I'm like, all right, and like they have these great moments of they're talking about this is the end of the world, and I suppose the only real casualty in the Lord of the Ring books is actually Middle Earth itself, because it is no longer the same land. Like it has kind of like lost its innocence. Certainly the Shire has. But we digress
briefly because you mentioned Tolkien. I'm just going to throw out there that again, that's very much Tolkien's worldview. He was a Catholic writing a consciously Catholic fantasy. He said subconsciously in the first draft, consciously so in the revision. And are you familiar with his concept of eucatastrophe?
No.
So eucatastrophe is a shockingly good thing that happens by what appears to be coincidence, but probably it's the hand of God. Like everybody keeping Gollum alive long enough that Gollum bites the ring off of Frodo because people are weak, so Frodo falls to ultimate evil at the end. No one was strong enough to destroy the ring. You had to have this catastrophe where, because no one killed Gollum for like 4 books, he shows up, does what he finally wants to do, and goes skittering off the end of the brick and not brick, the stone pathway, and melts. And that's Tolkien's idea of eucatastrophe. That it's the opposite of a catastrophe. It's a really, really good thing that randomly happens.
That's interesting.
But it's God.
Yeah, so it's kind of Deus Ex Machina adjacent, more or less.
That right? Actually is. That is very Deus Ex Machina adjacent. But again, I would say with Gollum, everybody is always like, should I kill this guy? No, I'm not going to kill him. It's like the opposite of every story you heard from the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War, where like American soldiers are nice to someone and they come back and like shoot them in the face. Like Lone Survivor has a big element of that in it, and this is like the exact opposite of that. But now we've really wandered.
Well, I want to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and we can go back to. I do want to quickly read the section because I found it in Shadow Dark here.
Read it from Shadow Dark,
which I found interesting because as soon as we were talking about death in games, it instantly came to me because again, this is like one of those moments where you read something and you're like, yes, I'm completely on board. So it's under Not the Enemy and character death. Character deaths will happen, especially among 0-level adventurers. The dice can be fickle, and crawlers sometimes get into more trouble than they can handle down in the Shadow Dark. When a character dies due to the player's choices and it makes sense, it was a just death. If there's uncertainty, did you remember to add your Constitution modifier to your death timer? Clarify and then let fate fall. And then she writes, a game world without death is one without risk or tension.
I agree.
Yeah.
And again, that ironically, that is what D&D has taught me, was the importance of character death.
Yeah, one of my players in Strahd actually, they play in another game where character deaths aren't allowed, and they were remarking a few weeks ago, like, no, it's really because their character died in my Strahd game, and they were like, wow, this is the first time.
All right, I'm going to go back to reading time then, if that's okay with you.
Taking away the moments that make up a dull day.
All right. I'm going to stop every 2 paragraphs so we can comment, but I'm going to say let's try and get through 2 paragraphs at a slice. That okay?
Yeah, but I'm sorry, Mr. Riggs, but you could not have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. Uncle Gary has just left,
We have to talk about that. Go ahead.
Right? How many people keep strict time records? Do you, Mr. Riggs?
No.
Yeah. I mean, I try to, but and is your campaign still meaningful?
So, well, interesting. I will say my current One Ring campaign, I have kept better time than any other campaign I've ever done. Every other campaign I've been like, kind of whatever. But One Ring has these Christmas mechanics. Because it's a subconsciously Catholic work, so of course there's a Christmas mechanic in the Lord of the Rings, in the One Ring role playing game.
Right.
So I need to know when Christmas is. So I've been keeping track.
That is so weird. I haven't played now. I've been wanting to pick it up for a while. It has a Christmas mechanic?
The short answer is yes.
And explain, like, did you suddenly have to celebrate? Do you have to put does your characters have to put a tree up? And
so there are two
Black Friday
phases in the One Ring campaign. There's the adventuring phase, which is exactly what we think about when we think of a role-playing game. Hey, your patron gives you a mission. Surprise, surprise, the next mission my characters are going to go on is Saruman is going to tell them to go to Moria to find ring lore. So they're going to have to go digging around Moria looking for the secrets of the lesser rings. They hopefully go to Moria. Maybe they find these things, maybe they don't, but that adventure ends in some way, shape, or form. You fast travel back to Isengard, which is their home base, and the fellowship phase begins. The fellowship phase is everything that happens between adventures. And there's essentially moves that you can make. You can go study. You can learn things about the area. You can make a friend. You can develop a skill. But there's these moves you can make. But if the fellowship phase falls during the Yule season, there are special moves that are unlocked that are only available at Yule, Christmas. And just before Christmas, I did a Christmas-themed ghost story with the One Ring. Because if you may know, there's a long English tradition of ghost stories at Christmas, like Christmas Carol. So I tried to do a Lord of the Rings Christmas Carol adventure. I'd love to know if my players thought it worked or not. But you essentially special moves are unlocked at Christmas that you can only do at Christmas in the One Ring game. It's brilliant.
What are those moves?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Okay, no worries.
But I agree with you that it's amazing that Gary Gygax is so adamant about something that most of us are like, meh, about,
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a very simulationist book, and I think there's something to be said for. I have tried to keep time records well in the past. As a matter of fact, we do, like, my home world has 2 moons, depending on what the people out there are like, oh, he's totally ripping off Dragonlance. Here's a thought. Everything in my home campaign is ripped off of something. But now I'm thinking about the AD&D version of Dragonlance. Same thing. They have 2 moons, and based on what the moons are, they can change how your spells go off.
That's cool.
Which is kind of interesting. Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about the world of Dragonlance. There's some high fantasy I have some weird thoughts about, but boy howdy is the AD&D Dragonlance campaign sourcebook really good and really interesting for including everything you would want about a campaign world. Anyway, moving on.
All right.
Yeah.
Next paragraph. Go ahead.
Anyway, just everyone out there, again, if you're not keeping strict time records,
you're doing it wrong.
You're doing it wrong, guys.
So the last sentence we read was, you cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept, in all caps, with no exclamation point. Use whatever grouping of days you find desirable for your milieu. There is nothing wrong with 7-day weeks and 31, 30, and 28/29 day months, which exactly correspond to our real system. On the other hand, there is nothing to prevent you from using some other system if it pleases you, and you can keep it straight. What is important to the campaign is that you do, in fact, maintain a time record which logs the activities and whereabouts of player characters and their henchmen. For the sake of example, and a long example now unfurls, let us assume that you begin your campaign on day 1 of the year 1000. There are 4 player characters who begin initially, and they have adventures which last a total of 50 days.
This is a word problem for all of you out there. You're going to want to be writing this down to figure out which train is going to get there first. Sorry, Ben. Thanks.
It's okay. 6 days of actual adventuring and 44 days of resting and other activity. At this point in time, 2 new players join the game, and one of the original group decides to go seek the advice of an oracle after hiring an elven henchman, and the remaining 3, quote, old boys, end quote, decide they will not go with the newcomers. Yeah. So on day 51, players player A's character is off on a journey. Those of B, C, and D are resting on their laurels, and E and F enter the dungeon. The latter pair spend the better part of the day surviving, but do well enough to rest a couple of game days and return for another try on day 54, where they stumble upon the worst monster on the first level, surprise it, and manage to slay it, and come out with a handsome treasure. You pack it in for the night. 4 actual days later, and it's best to use 1 actual day equals 1 game day when no play is happening. I want to read that again. 4 actual days later, and it is best to use 1 actual day equals 1 game day when no play is happening. On day 55, players B, C, and D enter the dungeon and find that the area they selected has already been cleaned out by player characters E and F. Had they come the day after the previous game session, day 52, and done the same thing, they would have found the monster and possibly gotten the goodies. What to do about that? And what about old A and his pointy-eared chum off to see the Oracle? Should I keep going, or should we talk about this part now?
Well, I mean, again, we can
We got
poke
through 2
fun at,
paragraphs.
yeah, that was amazing, and we can poke fun at the AD&D DMG guide. I just want to say, because like this is a section that's this kind of asking for like I mean, it's amazing, but it's also a bit silly. I just want to say that with all reverence, as we kind of like poke apart some of these, I mean, it truly does read like a story problem that you have to figure out. Oh, I get the point here, which is that, I mean, a little bit of editing would have gone a long way to say, basically, if you're not tracking time and you've got a lot of people in your campaign, and again, this speaks to the old school role-playing game, which is that you might have a campaign with 9 players, and obviously, when you've got that large, some people are going to be there for some sessions, some people aren't going to be for their session. If you want the verisimilitude of a world that is constantly in motion, even when folks aren't playing, yeah, you can't kill the dragon and have a guy come back and say, I want to go kill the dragon. And you have to say, well, it's a bit too late.
Well, the thing I find interesting is apparently this is before the social contract of we're all just going to go together had emerged. Because it's clear that these people are like, I'm not going to go into the dungeon with these new people. We don't know who they are.
Yeah.
Like, that would nowhere fly in the 21st century. Like, half the group just rejects the new people and is, man, fudge off. Like, that would not happen at a table today. And if it did, like, you might not even run the session, right? You might be like, well, I, the DM, will not run 2 separate adventuring parties in this one dungeon. You're all going together. Tough nuggets. And the example continues on for what looks like at least 2 more paragraphs. Shall I read?
Yeah, go for it. And
all right.
I just can't believe that those old boys would not go with the newcomers. That is not how you bring people into the hobby, folks.
So the last line of the last paragraph was, what to do about that? And what about old A and his pointy-eared chum off to see the Oracle? Some penalty must accrue to the non-active,
yeah.
But on the other hand, the overactive cannot be given the world on a silver platter. Despite time differences, the activities of the newcomers to the campaign should be allowed to stand, as Destiny has decreed. Capital D Destiny has decreed that the monster in question could not fall to the characters B, C, and D. Therefore, the creature was obviously elsewhere, not dead, when they visited its lair on day 52, but it had returned on day 56. Being aware of time differences between groups of player characters will enable you to prevent the big problems. You will know when the adventuring of one such group has gone far enough ahead in time to call a halt. This is particularly true with regard to town/dungeon adventures. Are you familiar with, I think it's the Western Marches? I think that's the style of campaign.
West Marches. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's exactly what I was thinking about. So a friend of mine has taken my campaign world and created another games based off of my game world, and it's a West Marches style game, and they have 3 different groups that are currently playing. And so when we're talking about this, it's funny because we think about this as an old school concept, right? This idea that you would have this kind of world that's more like, almost like an MMO going on, and people can jump in and do a dungeon from time to time. And of course, West Marches style, it's, from Matt, where credit due, is a concept that Matt Colville came up with, which is very much a player-driven campaign. The concept that when you want to play, you get the players together and the DM is just ready to go whenever. Which is what this offshoot of my game, and I'm playing in one little nugget of it, but it's really taken off, to the point that they've, like I said, they've got 3 different adventuring groups that are currently exploring different areas of this world on a regular basis.
And would you summarize again? I am not. I've watched a few videos on West March's style campaigning. It looks interesting to me, but would you agree that to summarize the style, it would be it's very player driven, though, but the world is pretty constant. The thing that makes it easier on the dungeon master is, you might be running 2 or 3 or 4 groups, but you only ever prep this one environment, and no matter where the player characters go, it's the environment that you have prepped. They are sharing the same, like an MMO. You're right. They're sharing the same persistent game world. If player group A kills Azog, the orc chieftain, the other players hear that he's dead, and this other group did it. Right?
Yes, yeah. The way that they, and I'm not, the funny thing is an offshoot, and I play kind of irregularly on this group, so I'm not, and I've never seen. It's funny. I'm coming to the Matt Colville information. I know that everybody's kind of excited about West March
I
stuff,
can't see it because he blocked me on Twitter.
Yep, I've never seen the original videos as well. I'd like to go back and actually watch them.
I probably watched them because I love Matt Colville, so I probably watched them.
In a nutshell, the way that they run it is there's a map, and it's a hex map, and they're slowly uncovering all of the hexes. And the players get together and they're like, okay, we've heard rumors. Like the DMs throw a bunch of like kind of vague little adventure hooks, and the players have to get together and figure out which ones they want to follow up on. Like, why are we hearing about goblin activity in these caves? Why are we hearing about, oh my gosh, somebody actually was abducted from the town. Should we go try to figure out who they are? But they've got to get together and get the DM, and then the DM kind of runs these. And I think the DMs generally have like a bunch of like little like one-shot level little dungeons that they're ready to go to kind of, modularly, I don't know if that's a word, place in and make work. And it's not really entirely my jam, since I kind of like the concept of larger character narrative arcs. But it is really, really fun, and it's really interesting to watch the map suddenly begin to unfold in such a randomly like being created map, because the DMs have a lot of fiat as to what's actually going to be in those hills, and then they work together. There's 3 DMs working in this West Marches game.
Can I
they
read?
All have to coordinate.
Can I read briefly off of Secrets of the Barrow Maze, since we wandered into West Marches, which this is an extemporaneous podcast. So
who wrote Secrets of the Barrow Maze?
Let's see. Does not have a author at the top, but here's what it defines West Marches and then gives some crucial texts.
Sure.
But what a West Marches campaign basically boils down to is that it is a campaign format where larger groups of players can all enjoy the same persistent and ongoing campaign world, where the actions of one party can affect the world for all players.
Yeah.
Sort of like an MMORPG like EverQuest or World of Warcraft. If you're looking for a more in-depth definition, there are a number of great articles. Ars Ludi, Grand Experiments, West Marches by Ben Robbins, which I read. And Ben Robbins is the creator of the West Marches campaign format. Ben
Robbins came up with this concept?
Yeah, and then, of course, there's Matt Colville explaining it right below, which luckily I can still see his YouTube channel. So I'll put in the show notes this link to Secrets of the Barrow Maze. So go ahead and talk for 1 second while I make that show
Ben
note.
Robbins is one of my favorites because he's the one who came up with the Microscope RPG. I don't know how many folks have played that, but it's the if anybody hasn't played Microscope, it's a game you should definitely take an opportunity. So, and I know he's created a lot of things since, but I still love going back to Microscope RPG, which is this use nothing but index cards, and you create basically epic mythologies for any type of genre world that you want. You can do science fiction and fantasy. It's really, really fun. And it's always my go-to when a regular campaign can't go. I'm either playing Fiasco by Jason Morningstar, or I'm doing Microscope by Ben Robbins. It's interesting that he came up with a West Marches system of play. I suppose kind of fits in that concept. Yeah.
All right. Should I keep going with this example of play?
Yes, please.
All right. So, returning to player character A and his trek to visit a far-off source of supernatural lore, he and his elven companion set off on day 51, journey across the land for 11 days, visit the Oracle, and remain 3 days, then come back in another 11 days, wonder of wonders. This comes to a total of 25 days all told, counting day 51, so they may come, quote, home, end quote, on day 75, and are set to adventure on day 77. Let us suppose, as a brief rest is in order, allowing that activity to be not unusual for a single session of play, then player character A and his henchmen are ready to play about the same actual time as the other players. Only A is at day 77, B, C, and D are at day 54, E and F are at day 58. The middle group must go first and alone, or it can opt to sit, quote, sit around, end quote, waiting for A or for E and F, or for both parties, or they can operate alone for another short adventure in terms of game time, thus taking advantage of their temporal position. Other options include any of the players singly or in time related groups going off on outdoor adventures. In the case of players so segregating their characters, it then becomes necessary for you, as DM, to inform prospective game participants in a game session that there is a hiatus, which will necessitate only certain members of their number playing together, as their respective characters cannot locate the others of the separated groups. At this juncture, they should be informed of their options. And if players B, C, and D do not choose to take advantage of their favored position, then game time will pass more swiftly for them, as the other participants must be allowed to adventure in the dungeon if they so desire. Thus, players E and F would have the choice of awaiting the return of A or of going on adventures which involved only the two characters. In effect, player character A is out of it until game time in the central playing area reaches day 75, when communications can be made, or until other player characters contact him on his return from the Oracle, let us say, assuming nothing important transpired during the return trip. In effect, the key is the relative import of the player character's actions in the time frame. Generally, time passes day to day or turn for X number of real minutes during active play. Players who choose to remove their characters from the center of dungeon activity will find that, quote, a lot has happened while they are away, end quote, as adventures in the wilderness certainly use up game days with rapidity. While the shorter time scale of dungeon adventuring allows many game sessions during a month or two of game time. Of course, this might mean that the players involved in the outdoors someplace will either have to come home to, quote, sit around, end quote, or continue adventuring in wilderness and perhaps in some distant dungeon as well, if you are kind. Otherwise, they will perforce be excluded from game sessions which are taking place during a period of game time in which they are wandering about in the countryside doing other things. This latter sanction most certainly applies to characters learning a new language, studying and training for promotion and level, or off somewhere manufacturing game items. At some point, even the stay at homes will be forced to venture forth into the wilderness due to need Geas, Geas, that means spell, I think, quest, or possibly to escape the wrath of something better avoided. The timelines of various player characters will diverge, meet, and diverge again over the course of game years. This makes for interesting campaigns and helps form the history of the milieu. Groups of players tend to segregate themselves for a time, some never returning to the ken of the rest, most eventually coming back to reform into different bands. As characters acquire henchmen, the better players will express a desire to operate some of theirs independently while they, or their liege lord, are away. This is a perfectly acceptable device, for it tends to even out characters and the game. Henchmen tend to become associates, or rivals, this way, although a few will remain as colorless servants. You may ask why time is so important if it causes such difficulties with record keeping, dictates who can or cannot go adventuring during a game session, and disperses player characters to the four winds by its strictures. Well, as initially pointed out, it is a necessary penalty imposed on characters for certain activities. Beyond that, it also gives players yet another interesting set of choices and consequences. The latter tends to bring more true to life quality to the game, as some characters will use precious time to the utmost advantage, some will treat it lightly, and some will be constantly wasting it to their complete detriment. Time is yet another facet which helps to separate the superior players from the lesser ones. If timekeeping is a must from a penalty standpoint, it is also an interesting addition from the standpoint of running a campaign.
I think it's interesting because we just talked a second ago around the concept of West March's campaign, and that seems to be what he's describing here, right? He is describing this kind of living world that people can come in and out of and have consequences for, but that the time is that the time of the campaign world has to be thought of as an actual character or agent within the game as well, because it is dividing people upon the opportunities, upon the things they can do, and of course at the end we have this concept that the superior player, and that's the term that obviously Mr. Gygax has used, is those that will take this agency most seriously to put it to their advantage. There's no way I'm getting through the session without saying my favorite quotation from any book of all time, which is time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so. As you read that, that's constantly going through my head, this concept that time is a rather flexible actual construct of ourselves, and which I find interesting. This is dipping into my realm of academic study, which is that Gygax is absolutely contextualizing time as a very strict boundary for the experiences of the players, one that shouldn't be too flexible for reasons of verisimilitude, for reasons of separating players from the different levels of play, and from, of course, making sure that the world feels, well, verisimilitude, making sure that the world feels actually real and that things that can't happen. It was interesting because you said a second ago, and I swear I'll stop after this, you had mentioned that somebody says, West March's campaign is more like an MMO, like an EverQuest or World of Warcraft. The thing that I couldn't stand about those games when they came out is how every player can take down the Lich King, right? There isn't it's completely at odds with this concept of like, well, if somebody's already killed the dragon and taken the goods, it's gone. You missed your opportunity. You maybe shouldn't have kicked out the newcomer so quickly. At the same time, like MMORPGs are so kind of crazy. We have to set aside that verisimilitude of thinking like, okay, I'm hanging out with 900 other people who've killed the Lich King, because the world exists more for the players in those high level MMORPGs, where this world in many ways exists for itself.
Wow. I have some thoughts about, wow.
Time is
So
illusion, lunchtime doubly so, by the way, is from Douglas Adams. It's my favorite quotation of all time because it gets at both the absurdity of the concepts of times, the things that we've lived by, but also the human need to eat lunch.
it's really easy to think that video games are somehow superior to tabletop. And it's really easy to think that even AI is going to solve the remaining
Right.
issues in the video game world, and that we're all going to be playing some kind of an amazing computer simulation uh, instead of doing tabletop role-playing games in just a generation. But when you get to things like this, I am skeptical. The thing that you pointed out, that there is no persistence in the video game world across games. There's only one Lich King, and if someone else kills him, you missed the boat. That ability to be that strictly simulationist is a unique quality of the tabletop role-playing game. Uh, and that's just a cool thing I'd never considered before. Amazing that you pointed that out. Um, I also think that reading this section, which I would have agreed with you at the beginning, I think we're going to be making fun of Gygax a lot during
Mhm.
this, is shockingly brilliant. Um, and I think that Gary is right, although for wrong reasons. I think that he is right, and again, like, obviously you don't have to run every game this way, but I can see how. I think the West Marches campaign, because again, I read Ben Robbins' article a while ago. I want to say it sprang out of this directly. Um, and I can see how it would, because this really promotes an interesting and probably really fun style of play where it's so simulationist uh, that, much like character death, it must feel really real because you're just sharing this world with so many more people, and your actions will impact those people, which again must be amazing for the suspension of disbelief. I also want to point out, even though his example of play is rather convoluted, and could be written better, the fact that he gives us an example of play is crucial. Before critical, like I read this article about the history of tabletop role-playing games in Japan, and tabletop role-playing games in Japan were driven by players writing up their game sessions as stories and then publishing them in magazines. And that was the engine that fueled TTRPG growth in Japan. And apparently one of the reasons that D&D has not become isn't huge in Japan, especially not compared to the 1980s. Call of Cthulhu apparently is the bigger game. And one of the reasons for that is because TSR got really skittish about people publishing obviously branded D&D, essentially fan fiction, and they put their foot down on the matter. And that is the reason that Call of Cthulhu has taken off more than D&D in Japan. But for Gygax to use that tool, which apparently before Critical Role was one of the best ways to inform people about how to actually play a role-playing game, again, I think it works here. Even though again it's creaky and weird in places, but this is Gygax actually I think at some of his best, where he has an interesting idea and he's actually showing you how to play the game, not just giving you rules that you're going to be confuzzled by at the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could certainly be edited down a bit. I mean, you're right. He's walking you through this kind of concept of like what would actually happen in a campaign. And as we mentioned before, it's interesting to come back to, you know, this is, one of the Urtex, obviously, of the tabletop role-playing game movement. And here's something that sounds, and what happens to us is that we actually find an analog to a style of play that is the West Marches style of play, which we think of as fairly new. It's interesting to go back to this book and be like, my gosh, she's literally laying down the blueprint for something that we're now playing kind of more that we think of as actually kind of a contemporary approach to play. It's also interesting, of course, that this is the same book that's going to have Appendix N. I mean, this is a much more simulatious style to approaching a world than necessarily a narrative one. I said a minute ago that we think about like an MMO is very much around the players are the center of the world. We've got to make sure that all of the players can be the heroes that they want to be. And Appendix N, a lot of the text in Appendix N are what I don't want to cast a giant generalization around the text in Appendix N, but if I think of Kothar the Barbarian or Conan the Cimmerian or whoever I want to talk about, like those tend to be rather heroic centric figures. And we always talk about this concept that Dungeons and Dragons is meant to make you feel like a hero. But if you read this section about the time section, about you're slowly uncovering hexes in many ways, or there's all these, the world is a fun house, but if you want to be a superior player, you've got to be on top of things and making sure that you're not missing opportunities, that you're taking advantage of time as a real agent in the world. And that's rather different than the type of experiences that you're going to read from most of the texts in Appendix N, which are, if they're not necessarily player-centric, they're certainly hero-centric, right? There's not a lot of simulationist qualities in a lot of the stories that you're going to run into at Appendix N. They're very much around creating fantasies of, powerful protagonists kind of going at, actually another example is, and it's funny because I would say they're not always the most powerful, but if you think of Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, they're not off, like they're almost all of their tales kind of exist in when Liber's writing about one of the tales, he's not necessarily concerned about when it's going to happen. The ages of when they're adventuring always kind of seem to be flying all over the place. It depends on what makes the best story. But here, Mr. Gygax is saying we really do want to keep to the stricture of a timed world where things happen in a certain environment, and it does get away. This is the simulationist move, necessarily away from what creates the most exciting narrative arc for players' characters.
There's only 2 paragraphs left. I'm going to read them just so that we can say we finished it. We finished something in the DMG. Okay?
Please.
All right. Time in the dungeon. Keeping track of time in the dungeon, or any other type of adventure, is sometimes difficult, but it is at least as important as the accurate recording of time in the campaign. As has been mentioned elsewhere, The standard time breakdown is 10 one-minute rounds to the turn, 6 turns to the hour. All referees should keep a side record of time on a separate sheet of paper, marking off the turns as they pass. Melees or other actions which result in fractional turns should be rounded up to make complete turns. It is essential that an accurate time record be kept so that the DM can determine when to check for wandering monsters. And in order to keep a strict check on the duration of some spells, such as Bless, Haste, Strength, etc., the DM must also know how long it has been since the last time the party took a rest. A party should be required to rest at least 1 turn in 6. Remember, the average party packs a lot of equipment. And in addition, they should rest a turn after every time they engage in combat or any other strenuous activities. On occasion, a party may wish to cease movement and, quote, hold up, end quote, for a long period, perhaps overnight, resting and recuperating or recovering spells. This does not exempt them from occasional checks for wandering monsters, though the frequency may be moderated somewhat depending on conditions. Too frequent interruptions may make spell recovery impossible. Keeping correct records of duration of these periods is absolutely essential. And again, we come back to the word essential, which again, it was meaningful in the beginning, and now it's essential. Your campaign won't be meaningful if you don't keep time. And at the end, he's like, it's essential that you keep time. So, anything you want to say about that, Scott?
No, I'm going to let Mr. Gygax have the last word.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Unbelievably, we actually finished a complete section in the DMG. Yay, crab hands. Go team. I'll mention again our Patreon. We would love it if you would support us. For $3 a month, you get access to our Discord, which I'm actually checking and posting on. Thank you very much. And again, for the price of about a cup of coffee a month, you get the satisfaction of supporting the podcast. Please come do so. We're going to keep finding amazing things to throw at patrons. I'm not going to say any just yet because I don't want to curse us. But hopefully I have something exciting that I can announce soon on that front. Teaser. Scott, and buy my book, Slaying the Dragon: A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, if you have not already done so. It's available everywhere. Scott, anything you want to shout out about?
No, if anybody wants to read my dissertation, of course, I'm happy. I do a lot of, like, the Discord channel is just a fantastic place to find me. If you have any questions, Sentry, otherwise that you want to live, I'm happy to field any messages both in the regular Discord channel or through PM as well. So, yeah, it's a fun community. This is just so much fun to talk about on a regular basis.
Hopefully, if you are listening to this, we are now available on Apple Podcast and YouTube Music. Right now, hopefully we're available on Apple as I speak. We should be available on YouTube Music by the time you are hearing this, which will then complete our distribution channels. So tell your friends. Hopefully we're available everywhere as of you hearing this.
This fully armed and operational podcast.
Thank you. That was amazing. All right. Well, Scott, you have a great Sunday. Listeners, you have a great Sunday too.